Here we go. Welcome to Wabash Center webinar. The topic of this webinar today is What is Still True? Survival of Theological Education. I am Lynne Westfield, Director of the Wabash Center. The staff for our webinar is Carly Hollinsby, our producer, and Paul Myrie is in the sound engineer's booth. During our conversation, if you'd like to bring a question to the conversation, the way to do that is to email Paul Myrie at myhrep@wabash.edu. That's myrep@wabash.edu. It is my great pleasure to introduce my friends, my colleagues, my road dogs. First up is President and Dr. Angela Sims. She is president of Colgate, Rochester, Crozer, Divinity School. Welcome, Angela, to the conversation.
Thank you.
And President Stephen G. Ray Jr., president of Chicago Theological Seminary. Welcome, Stephen, also to the conversation.
Thank you.
I want to start talking about some basics in this conversation about what is still true in theological education. I know both of you to be deeply committed to theological education and its mission. So I want you to talk, first of all, personally. Angela, I'm going to start with you personally. Why are you so committed to theological education?
I think one of the reasons I remain committed to theological education is that human conversations about God remain a part of the world. And to be involved in forming folk to have conversations at a deep level that allow them to think about the implications. So speaking from a perspective as a social ethicist, to think about the implications of God talk on everyday people and on this world that we call home is of extreme importance for me. And I think that each crisis moment in the life of a country, in the life of a people, serve to reinforce the need for quality graduate theological education.
Yeah, I believe the same thing, that part of folks who are stymied from the government on down and unable to critically think about, imaginatively think about this moment, to me is the lack of theological education, the lack of the ability to think imaginatively, critically about all that we participate in. Stephen, come on into the conversation. Tell us about your commitment. And the question is why? Why be committed to theological education in the 21st century?
Well, I think there are two ways I answer that question. The first is to say that what I understand theological education to be is the opportunity to step back from the hurly-burly of life and to know God truly. And with that sort of opportunity that's provided by theological education, there are ways that all of the lenses that are given to us, all of the frames that are given to us that distort reality, that theological education allows us, even if for only a moment, to step back from those and to begin to see the world anew and to begin to see what the possibilities are. And the second, which is not unlike what Dr. Sims just suggested, is that I think that particularly for communities that are marginalized, particularly for communities that have been underprivileged in terms of education, in terms of tools for understanding on a systemic level what is going on in their world and connecting that with their faith, theological education, when it is well done, provides the opportunity to let people into the head of the beast and not simply be a resident of its stomach, where we all will simply end up being digested.
Go ahead, Angela, go ahead.
And
please.
yet, Dr. Ray, when I think about that metaphor about being allowed into the head of the beast, one of my great concerns is that often when I think about the professor in that space facilitating learning, often so much of what I hear repeated comes from the belly of the beast, not from the head of the beast. And a question always arises for me is, what are the ways in which you and I and others have a responsibility to actually provide opportunities for a shifting of the way in which that learning takes place.
So much of the learning in theological education, because that's what we're talking about, is oppressive, adds to the oppression, adds to the burden of the people, rather than relieving the burden of the people. So I hear President Ray when he says quality education, not just any old theological education, but theological education that is liberative, that stokes the imagination, that lets people know that there is hope in the world, is very different than some of the other ways of doing education. So both of you serve as presidents, which of very prestigious schools. So that gives you a unique vantage. So Stephen, let's start with you. What do you see from where you are? What's theological education like right now? And then we'll move into the COVID conversation, move into the pandemic conversation, which, I mean, I know that's a part of that, but from your responsibility and opportunity as a president, where is theological education right now?
Well, I think that where theological education stands now, and I'll touch on it in two different places, right? The first place that I will touch it is theological education is now, when it's done well, awakening to how it is that people are being religiously motivated in different ways and in new realities, and responding to that in ways that provide the opportunity for people to find themselves to be rooted in the long tradition of the Christian faith, but also other faith traditions, right? So that people are not having to make it up on their own. But I think one of the other realities, and this is the one that's probably most urgent for us, is that theological education was largely a project of the middle class of the 20th century. So that as that middle class is collapsing, and when I say middle class, I mean people who are largely a part of what we used to describe as the managerial class and the white collar class, supported by high wage earners in the blue class, who were sort of the stalwarts of Protestant congregational life. As that class collapses, the major basis upon which we found our sustenance in terms of finances is collapsing as well. And this has been happening for at least the last decade. And I think that part of what we're feeling now is that institutions are in jeopardy, and it's not because their project is not needed, and it's not because their project is not valued. It's that the economic structure upon which the entire logic of theological education was provided is collapsing before our eyes.
Part of the statement that you just made is not you speculating. That's a historic understanding that most seminaries were built and constructed in the 1900s with those kind of people in mind, serving those kinds of congregations. Angela, come on into the conversation. Give us your perspective.
So I use this notion of theological education being at a tipping point. And Stephen points to that in his remarks. And I'd like to just push that a little bit further, because when we talk about this project, we need to name it correctly. It's a project in predominantly white, mainstream identified institutions or churches. And when higher ed institutions, when seminaries find themselves aligned with those churches, those faith traditions, often we find ourselves now having to say, are we in service solely to that enterprise, when that enterprise itself is struggling for its own survival and wanting the seminary to be and I mean the literally, the response to what's wrong with them. And I think at some point I find myself saying, how do we honor our historical roots and our affiliation, regardless of how deep or how tangential that relationship might be now, while at the same time recognizing that theological education, as I mentioned earlier, should have never been solely for the purposes of providing congregations with well-educated clergy people. And I think that in some ways, where we find ourselves now is rethinking our purpose and how that purpose still needs to be of value to church and world, while at the same time being able to understand our distinctive differences from, example, a school of the humanities, because we are different, but it's being able to articulate that difference in such a way that we are able to still live faithfully into both our mission and our vision and our stated purpose.
So what are our choices if we're going to move from a sole purpose, singular purpose, to a multi-purpose? The choices usually scare people to death, or raise their sexism, raise their racism, raise their heterosexism, raise all the biases that have been institutionalized in the sole purpose institution.
But if we look at both of our schools, if Stephen and I look at both of our schools and we look at the profiles of our graduates, history says that we have never existed solely for the church, but often the public message is such that seminaries are understood from a large percentage of the population as only existing for service to the church. And I think it presents me, I know for myself, it presents me with an opportunity to think about messaging and the way in which we articulate beyond our perhaps current supporters and friends that we have for decades educated persons to serve in multiple areas in the world and
for multiple vocations.
Multiple vocations.
Mm-hmm. President Ray, come on into the conversation.
Well, I think if I could step back for a moment and put on my theologian hat, I think it makes a difference that I approach the project as someone who is a dyed-in-the-wool Calvinist. You've heard me say that many times.
Many times.
Who is of significant Augustinian bent. So for me, there's a way in which I have never proceeded with the idea that theological education could save a fallen world. But I've always proceeded with the idea that theological education, when well done, and I keep using that phrasing, when well done, can save many of the perishing in this world, because it can provide people ways of seeing through the code of the matrix to how the world really exists, and be able to see in ways that they can respond as individuals and as communities to be a part of God's life-giving power in the world, in the midst of a fallen world. So what that means then programmatically, and what it means then in terms of a vision for a seminary, is that it's the seminary understanding itself as being a part of God's salvific movement through the world that is providing a way for God's desire for felicity to the world to be made flesh in the midst of everything that we do, while at the same time not presuming that we will ever be of the consequence that we remember theological education to be. And when I say we remember, it's a false memory, but we still remember, right? Because when we were all in seminary, people used to remind us how Reinhold Niebuhr was on the cover of Time magazine, and how Paul Tillich was on the cover of Life magazine. And that was the golden age of theological education, when these theologians were on the cover of Time and Life magazine. But, Adolf Hitler was on the cover of Time magazine. Joseph Stalin was on the cover of Life magazine. So, these false memories create a false sense that our project can save the world, when what we can do is we can save those who are perishing in the world by helping to create spaces and places and imaginations that can move forward into other ways of being.
So let's continue to talk about the flesh part, right? So the available pools of people who are eligible to go to seminary tend not to be, we know this from the trends, male, white, and middle class. Now, part of it is because the the middle class structure of this country is crumbling, has crumbled, will continue to crumble. The available pools we know in seminaries are immigrant populations, people of color, primarily Latino folks, Latino folks. Most seminaries, many seminaries, are not interested in those fleshed people from those perspectives. So if we look at the project of theological education as it browns just like America browns, many schools would rather die than shift the populations in their own classrooms.
So we're both shaking our heads because what you're pointing to is the tough work, right? Of having to always be in this process of forming folk and thinking about what it means to form your folk who are your internal people. So forming and reforming faculty, forming and reforming administrators, forming and reforming board members, forming and reforming staff, so that onus is not that so that the onus shifts to the folk who are already in that place. And it may mean that some folk may have to make some hard choices about whether or not that's the place in which they want to be. If an institution is really committed to creating this learning space where brown bodies are not commodified, simply because they're going to an institution's bottom line in its budget.
But a president with that clarity has a target then on her. She is rarely heralded as visionary, marvelous person. You know, that when you try to move into that reality for survival of the institution itself, oftentimes you're seen as the enemy that's trying to move us into a place, I say us, into a place that is foreign, unwanted, you know, so there is a price to pay, there is a cost, there is a penalty for having that kind of reality, and the need to then take a prophetic stance, not just a leadership stance, but a prophetic stance about how theological education has to shift its own paradigm.
And so when you talk about flesh and shifting paradigm and being in a place where one might find one's voice, one's vision unwelcomed, it helps to know some of the narrative of the place in which that person now stands. And so folks from Rochester love to talk about Frederick Douglass, right? So how do you talk about Frederick Douglass and not, on the other hand, talk about the racial disparity that still exists in the small metropolitan community and the way in which we as an institution are called to address that, to educate our students, to shape and form our students, to be able to think about a theological response to any moral problem. And so part of accepting a call, and for me, this vocation is a call, and CRCDS is just one aspect on that journey of living into my always evolving and further understanding of my own vocational call, is that I stepped into this place knowing what might lay ahead. And I will say that sometimes there's a need for Black women in certain positions to also talk about how we are privileged to be in those positions and to be able to take the stance that we take. My mortgage is going to be paid if CRCDS fires me tomorrow. Not everyone can say that. And so we all make different choices, and it doesn't mean that one person's voice should carry more weight than another person's voice. It's that our realities are different, and how we approach a situation may be uniquely different as well.
President Ray, come on in.
Well, let me say a couple of things. When I started my position, I was very clear with everyone about what my primary objective was in trying to create a new future for CTS that was building on its past. and that was to disrupt the colonial project of wealth extraction from Black and Brown communities that characterizes theological education, who only looks to our community for students. Right? Because that is an act of wealth extraction. Because whatever the students have to pay in terms of student loans, because that's how most will finance it, that's money that won't go towards our communities. That's money that won't go to local congregations. That's money that won't go to local causes. So in terms of, disrupting this project, this colonial project of wealth extraction, there were two things that were very clear to me. Was that we have to reorient the institutions, and the only way you do that in the world that I know is by having different boards and having a different development office.
It's that practical, right? It's that pragmatic.
Two places, yeah. Right? Because those are the two places that white supremacy posits itself. Because those are the two places in which the primary support for the institution that is given honor are. So in terms of doing my work, certainly I have a vision about who our seminary ought to be. You know, I'm very clear in my vision in terms of us being an interfaith organization that's shaping people to change the public square. But I know we can't do that if white normativity is still at the center of our being. Mm-hmm. And so there's a significant kind of way in which going about that work, particularly in those two places, but then also in working with faculty and whatnot, because I've gotten too old to worry about symbolic stuff, right? I mean, so what that means is that, you know, taking symbolic positions, you know, telling people, isn't CTS all this great? Look at who they have as their president. I'm too old for that foolishness. I mean, we need to make some changes, particularly now in the midst of the disruptions in which we're living. And one of the things that I've always told my students that I carry with me is that if you are afraid, this is not the business to be in, because God does not need fearful people. So, you know, one of the things about my Calvinism is that I have a deep sense that I trust God fully in terms of my salvation, whatever that means. So my only concern is that I will disappoint God because I haven't used every opportunity that I have, and this is an opportunity to be a part of what I understand to be God's work in the world.
You know, Stephen, your comment reminds me, one of the things I often say is that we don't have the luxury of time. And I often think that part of the disruption that we do is to really challenge the way in which there's often a tendency to want to engage in extended deliberations. Mm-hmm. And this season and the season before it does not lend itself to that.
No, it doesn't.
And so part of our role as presidents is really understanding what it means to be decisive. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And if you're going to make a mistake, make it. Mm-hmm. Right? So let's pivot toward this crisis moment, right? This pandemic, when so many schools, all the schools went to a crisis pedagogy, have survived the crisis pedagogy, now anticipating summer into fall, needing to recoup, needing to re-strategize, hoping to go back to normal, even though we know normal is gone and not to be rekindled. From a president's perspective, what do you do? Like, how do you sift through the options when you can't see around the curve, when you can't see over the hill, when you don't know what the fall is going to bring?
So here's where I have found that being able to have developed a relatively strong executive leadership team, having established some healthy, positive relationships with my board, I find that those conversations on an almost weekly basis, particularly with my team and with the chair of my board, help me as I am working through issues, but also having conversational partners with other presidents, whether they are my colleagues in theological education or my colleagues who are at institutions here in the greater Rochester area, because things are changing too quickly. But one of my primary concerns is that with a shift to remote education or remote engagement, I don't call it online. For those of us who weren't already doing quality online education, Stephen's word, we simply made a pivot to remote engagement. And doing that in a time when no one has had the opportunity to really sit with trauma. And so the trauma is not being processed. And my concern is that my people, whenever we shift to a phased in approach to non-remote operations, I need my people to be as healthy as they possibly can be, which means I've got to think always about ways in which to provide them time to process this trauma.
You're talking about collaboration, you're talking about partnerships, you're talking about moments of listening deeply. And before you say, nope, no, I'm not consulting anybody, I know what's going on. That is a refreshing way to be at the top of these pyramids, right? And particularly in a time that feels like it's so acute as we try to move forward. Dr. Ray, how about you?
Well, I mean, one of the first things is that I have been, I had originally had a plan to reopen our building on June 1st. And it's not that I'm rushing trying to reopen, as it were, but I want to communicate to the world that we want to be a part of building whatever is going to be the reality that we're going to exist in, right? Because one of the things I've tried to communicate to my school very clearly is because we went online 7 years ago, and that's the majority of our program, we pivoted very easily to fully online pedagogy, fully remote staff. And I have to remind my school that is an act of privilege to be able to continue to stay online when the rest of the world has to figure out what does it mean to come back into this sort of broken world in which we're living. So we're having these discussions because to me, that's not unrelated to the way that white privilege works, right? White privilege works such that it's just you do what you do, and based upon the world that has been created for you, things are gonna work out for you.
As if context doesn't matter, right? You're saying context matters.
Yes, yes. And I think also one of the things that I'm trying to do is I continue to bring front and center in many of our conversations on every level of the institution that the community in which we find ourselves in the South Side of Chicago is going to be a community, the depths of the trauma which it is experiencing now will come as a revelation over time. Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things that you both know I'm a Civil War buff. And I mean, one of the things that was often written about how, particularly in the North, that there was not a home in many towns in which there was not an empty chair in everyone's house as a result of the war. In the same way, in many neighborhoods in the South Side of Chicago, and in the Chicagoland, particularly South Chicagoland, that's going to be the same thing, that there will be many places in which not a single home doesn't have an empty chair. So part of living into the reality of who and what our current and future students are, Black and brown people, centering what that trauma is going to mean for what they need from theological education, to deal with a deeply traumatized community, to be able to imagine a new world, I think is an act of trying to do responsible theological education, while at the same time ensuring that there's adequate representation on the board of people who know understand and don't make that trauma secondary, and inviting partners who understand and are deeply involved in trying to ameliorate that trauma as members of your donor base. And in terms of the relationships that you're building with community organizations, building relationships with people who are living in the midst of that trauma, because that's how you transform the response. So now you're not just a white liberal organization who's doing something for those people who are hurting so poorly, but their trauma actually becomes a part of the reality in which you exist at every level of your organization.
So the question won't be, did anybody in your family die during COVID? The question will be, how many people in your family died during COVID?
And who?
And who? And name those names, name those, I mean, which is a startling reality. On this side of that reality, we're still hoping, pretending, not facing up to, that's where we're moving fairly quickly. I got an email the other day from a student in a master's program who wanted counsel and advice on applying to a doctoral program in religion. And my immediate response was to put my head in my hands and say, I don't know if I would tell anybody to apply and try to enter a PhD program in religion and theology. Help us for students, right? What do we tell students, masters who are interested in doctoral work and doctoral students who are wondering what kinds of jobs will be available? Stephen and then Angela.
If you're going to be a part of this work, God doesn't have any time for fearful people. Someone is going to need to be in the classroom. Someone is going to need to be a dean. Someone is going to need to be a president. And for us to preemptively exclude ourselves from these offices such that we're having the same conversation 50 years from now, I think is the height of irresponsibility. So I'm aware of the challenges, but I also know that while there may not be as many jobs, at my school, we just hired 3 people. So people are still getting jobs. So it is an act of faith. And if that is what God is calling you to do, and if that is, then there are ways in which it may cash itself out in terms of being in the professorate. It may cash itself out in terms of being an administrator, or it may cash itself out as you being the person who becomes the mediator within your community with institutions that want to help, but don't have a clue what to do. And you, because you've gone and you've gotten your graduate work, you have a theoretical framework for which to join together theology, social theory, ideas about public policy, history, and all of these in ways that can be ameliorative for your community. Because don't do it for you, right? If you're doing it for you, no, don't do it. Because there are better paying jobs with a PhD, get an MBA. There are much better paying jobs, much less stress. But if you feel what God is calling you to do this for the people, and here I'm borrowing Sharon Flukel's language, for the people, then it is irresponsible to shirk because you're fearful that God won't provide opportunity for you.
President Sims.
The only thing I will say is now we see through a glass darkly, but then. So do the work.
Yeah, do the work. The path will open, do the work.
The path will open. And it may not be the path that one is thinking will unfold, but do the work.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. It feels fantastic to think about vocations that we need to be training for that don't yet exist. But that is the 21st century mentality. That is the reality. We are training people and being trained for vocations that don't yet exist.
Yep.
That's how quickly things are moving and churning and changing.
Yep.
Dr. Myrie, I suspect there are probably some questions from our viewers.
As always, there are a number of questions. I think following this last line of responses, I'll ask this question from Douglas. with COVID-19, our church body is facing up to the fact that many struggling congregations might not make it. This means fewer calls for our seminary graduates. How will this very possible scenario affect enrollment? And I would add in, I'm going to blend in somebody else's question, and the formation of the next generation of clergy and ministerial leadership.
So first of all, let me say that when we talk about privilege, I do have deep concern for smaller congregations who lack the technology in order to remain engaged with their parishioners on a regular basis. It is a privilege for those congregations who were able to pivot very, very quickly. I also question, in some ways, without being able to understand why this particular question is being asked the way it's being asked, I also question the way in which individuals who are engaged in the life of a congregation see themselves as part of a collective whole, and not from an individualistic, meaning not from just the perspective of themselves. And what does it mean in this moment to really step back and examine oneself, to even ask the question, why do we exist as a community? And perhaps in answering that question, that congregation might be able to better discern the ways in which, quote unquote, lay leaders are actually providing such wonderful pastoral service and community service that's grounded in their understanding of who a God of faith is. And that often, because they don't bear the title of reverend, their gifts are not seen as essential in the life of a community. It's also an opportunity to really rethink the way in which our own ethic of space shapes the way we think about ecclesiology, the purpose, nature, and function of the church.
Say more about that, Angela.
So on the one hand, when we think about church, we think about the people who have the shared understanding of what it means to be followers of the one who is way, truth, and life. On the other hand, we think about the building and the money and the property and all that entails. And it's not to say that that we don't need to think about them both, but often I think that they are seen as polar opposites.
President Ray, are you worried about admissions and dying churches?
Well, I think, certainly in terms of dying congregations, what COVID-19 has done in many congregations is that in the same way that it has exploited the pre-existing conditions of many people within the Black community, i.e. diabetes and high blood pressure, because of a whole bunch of cultural things, it's also accelerated what has been the reality of congregational life within America, and that is the collapse of the middle classes that I was talking about a bit earlier today. Congregational life in the United States, and for the most part, the majority of the people that we were preparing for congregational leadership were communities that were creatures of the mid-20th century and the social and economic contracts that we had back then. Those have been collapsing precipitously. And I mean, because part of what the issue is that, you've heard people talk about, well, younger people just don't have the kind of devotion. No, younger people just don't have the disposable income that their grandparents have. They don't have the disposable income. And one of the big issues for us, and I'm not going to harp on this at all, but our entire way of thinking about people, particularly within Protestant realities, but I think to some degree in other realities as well, as giving units. So what does it mean if someone doesn't have the capacity to give? It becomes a disincentive for them to engage themselves because they're shamed every time they walk through the door and can't write a check to the church. So that's a whole nother conversation. But I mean, that's sort of collapsing. But I think also I'm not concerned about enrollment, because in terms of how we are reshaping our lives, one, to tap into the vibrancy of the communities that will continue to exist. I mean, one of the things about theological education being connected, for instance, with the Pentecostal churches and movement, is a part of their DNA and communal memory is the storefront church, right? So for them, that's sort of the or moment for them, and not a congregation that was founded because a suburb was built, and now all of a sudden there were 3,000 or 4,000 families out in this part of Long Island or out in this part of Ohio. So they got together and formed a church, which a national church gave them money, so that all of a sudden, boom, this church, that's not part of their narrative. And if we have creative relationships with communities that have that narrative of making bricks without straw, if we have that communal narrative of cathedrals literally being built by the wages of washerwomen, there are ways in which this current situation of deprivation that we're in is not world shattering.
That's right. Congregations don't need denominational structures, and the history of congregations, the history of churches, is longer than denominational structures. So much of what I hear in the question is, now that denominations are crumbling, and certainly COVID is exacerbating the crumbling of these denominational structures, but they serve their purpose. It's time for them to go.
Well, Ted, I think another piece, and then I'll be finished with this, is that this is where theological tradition and outlook makes a difference, right? So if you're being led by someone like me, who is a dyed-in-the-wool Calvinist, who believes we live in a fallen world, I don't think that it's a shame that we try to live as a socially conscious and social justice organization. At the same time, we commit ourselves to shaping the leaders of tall steeple churches who aren't going anywhere. Mm-hmm. Right? And so part of what can be the problem is the narrative we create about ourselves. We create narratives that don't ask us to live into the tensions in which the world exists, which is wealth inequality and all of this. So we try to act as if it's one thing or the other, instead of trying to find a way as an institution to live faithfully in the tension, because that's what I think we're called to do.
Angela, did you want to comment?
No, I would agree with Stephen about living faithfully into the tension, but I think the other thing, Stephen, that you point to, in some ways ask, how do we, even as institutions, right, help some of the churches live into that tension? Mm-hmm.
I think that's true. I mean, so often students will say, I can't take what I'm learning back to my congregation. So that's one expression that, and sometimes I do push them, I have pushed them. On the other hand, I accept their critique. Some of the stuff that we are doing is so culturally inept, you cannot take it back. On the other hand, seminaries are beginning to, and this is what we're talking about in terms of the paradigm shift, saying, what kinds of degrees, what kinds of experiences, how do we lean into the religious experiences of particular traditions in order to cultivate and be more generative in leadership for those locations, whether they're ordained or not. I'm thinking about what Angela said earlier. Ordination is not the end all and be all of church leadership. Dr. Myrie, is there another question?
Of course. Here's a question that relates a bit to what you were just talking about, but also branches off. And that is, are the presidents able to share how they are approaching finances and budget planning for this year, next year, and beyond? With so many unknowns, how are they navigating, and what are the assumptions, and how are decisions being made?
Sure. I'm happy to share what we're currently doing, and with the understanding that it's subject to change any day. We're having our board meeting on Monday, and with our 2020-2021 budget, I have frozen all salaries. And we are, because there are so many unknowns, we have reduced our forecast for incoming students. We've also reduced the forecast for returning students because not knowing what the fall will bring and how many of our students may need to navigate serving as a teacher's assistant for an elementary or secondary age child who will be engaged in remote learning from home. And that same student also having to manage a full-time job that they're working remotely from home, or if they're a essential worker and navigating all that that entails. So not having that information says that we need to consider what happens if this, and that happens. Again, when I look at the market and I look at the demographics of our major donors, recognizing that a large percentage of their gifts come from withdrawals from their retirement accounts or from the redemption of stock. This is not the time when they should be making those gifts. And so trying to allow for that as well. We talk about privilege, and CRCDS did find ourselves in a privileged position when I made a unilateral decision. It's rare that I do that, but I made a unilateral decision on March 16th that we would suspend all active solicitations to our annual fund. And I made some calls to a few donors because I knew that they were in process of making some decisions. But it afforded us to be able to just do some care and some check-ins with our donors, to reach out to everyone in our database. And I realized that not all of my peers are able to do that. And so looking forward to the next 2 years, also holding salaries where they are and really looking at what realistic numbers might be for both donor giving as well as funds for being able to scholarship students. We have also applied and received funds from the CARES Act. And we're in the process of finishing paperwork to submit an application for the additional allocation that has been provided for our institution, and I know other institutions are on that list as well. And so taking advantage of the grants that are available and the low interest loans that might be available from the federal government.
Thank you.
Well, I think certainly in terms of our planning, we did some scenario planning, and we based it upon reduction in enrollments. And so we came up with 3 different scenarios. One is if it was a light recession. The other, if it was a deep recession that quickly turned into a depression. And the third model was if we moved into a depression. So our planning was such that in these worst case scenarios, we were able to see what we would need to do in order to make changes to our budget and to our reality as a school. Because you're part of what the thing that this caused us to do as a part of this planning was to ask the question, what is our core mission? So if everything else has to fall away, we want to focus on our core mission. But I think also one of the things that's a part of our planning as well is that precisely because we're in the midst of developing relationships with different communities that the school has had before on the levels, and you know, the 4 things I always say: enrollment, board members, donors, and community support, always keeping those up front, is that there are pockets of support within the communities that we're developing relationships with that have simply been waiting for someone to ask them for help. Now, certainly they're being affected by this COVID-19 reality and the financial implications, but we'd be in a very different situation if the only people we were looking at were the usual suspects in terms of our donors and in terms of sources of funds. Then I think we would be in some very deep trouble. But given that we have been developing creative relationships with hitherto untapped communities, communities that we had only looked at for tuition support, that's helping to, one, ameliorate and cushion some of what we're going through. But I think once we get through this, that will actually put us in a place that will be ahead of the curve, because if you have 5 communities that are deeply invested with you, you have a much brighter future than if you only have 2.
Thank you. Paul, I think we have time for one or two more. Let's try for one more.
Theological education, in some cases, has become a globally interactive environment. This person wrote about quite a bit about teaching a course. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I'm going to get to the question. Her question is this: how might you creatively use remote learning that honors a direct encounter or deep dive with immigrant communities and not succumb to a kind of global tourism? And I'm going to add in a different question with that you might want to respond to, and that is, how are your schools interacting with the global theological educational world?
Stephen, you want to start with that one?
Sure. I think that our response to that is largely shaped by geography. And I mean, one of the things that has deeply shaped me is how it was that the church and theological education became globally conscious precisely at the moment that they were being called upon to be responsible in their relationships with local communities of color. So what that means is that I'm not trying to pit these two against one another, because they're not, but I mean, that's been the history of theological education, is that at the precise moment that people like Jane Cones and others were calling it to responsibility with Black communities and with Brown communities, that's when theological education discovered the globe. And so part of what I face as our challenge and how we're responding is to ask the question, how do we live creatively into relationship with the people who live a block from us and who surround us on the south side of Chicago? And as that, in our transformation, ask, what does it mean to be a responsible global partner, but not one who is a white liberal organization choosing the world or the local brown folk, but actually an institution that so embodies the reality of the local Black and brown folk that as they look at the globe, they're not looking at the globe as a white liberal organization, but as an organization that is encompassing of the reality of what our society looks like within the United States.
Stephen, thank you for that. I, about 3 months ago, convened a group of folk to begin some conversations. We're an ad hoc committee right now around global relationships. And one of the questions that's before us is, who are CRCDS's listening partners? To whom do we sit and listen? And who has been perhaps always excluded from the voices to whom we listen? And I think those responses to those questions are going to be essential for us as we think about what it means for us to once again think about our relationships with individuals, organizations who may not necessarily be in our immediate geographical location. But we also find ourselves uniquely geographically situated in a campus that now runs parallel to an active railroad track. Mm-hmm. And we're on the side of the railroad track where life is relatively good. But on the other side of those railroad tracks are people whose lives have been further decimated as a result of this virus. Mm-hmm. And that should certainly shape what we're doing and to whom we're in conversation with.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Last one, Paul.
This is a question, complicated question actually, or simple. What is and isn't theological about theological education?
Dr. Sims?
So for me, the theological enterprise is really huge, but there is a difference between theology and anthropology. There is a unique difference. And at the heart of that is really being able to engage in questions about the divine, about life in ways that individuals began to make distinctions about, begin to understand why it is perhaps dangerous to make distinctions between the sacred and the secular, and to be able to have these conversations about mysteries, that which we really will never be able to fully define, and to understand the way in which engaging in that adds much contribution to this enterprise that's called life.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Well said. Dr. Ray.
Well, I think that what's theological and what's not theological is that theological education, as well as anything we describe as theological, is something that exists within the midst of the fallen human imagination. So what that means is that the limitations in terms of what we can hope and what we can dream about what tomorrow can be are precisely the places that God is actively at work. And I think that in terms of theological education, that's where God is actively at work in terms of us living into the future, creating new imaginations, but also in terms of what we think when we say the word theological. Because I think that that is, in a very real and significant way, the spaces in which the structures of fallenness, the powers and the principalities inscribe their power most significantly, because they lead us to the point of believing that in a real way we can know more than what it means to strive to be a part of God's project in the world. So, back when I was a theologian, I always said—
Before you were president.
Before I was a president. I said that if I would ever write a systematic theology, the title of it would be, Who the Hell Knows? Because at the end of the day, the only thing we know is that God means well for the world and invites us to be a part of that project. And that's the most we can say, and building our institutions as a part of that vision are critically important. Now, there is one more answer that I do have to a question that people thought it was too silly to ask. Yes, I'm addressing you from the 100-acre woods, and I bring you greetings from Pooh and the entire crowd.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And all that swirling in there together, right? That the doing of theology, the theological project, is in many ways the search for holiness and the raising your own awareness and the awareness in your community for the activity of God. So to say, is that theological? Yes. Is it not theological? Yes. I mean, that's the point, right? Is it worth doing? Some days not, right? That's kind of the way it goes. Tell us, as we wrap up, each of you tell us how to get in touch with your school, right? It might be just tell us to go to your website, but you know what I mean? Tell us, people will be interested in your own projects in your own schools. So do some commercials for your own schools.
www.crcds.edu.
Mm-hmm. And for us, it's our Facebook page is where you get the pulse of what's currently going on in our life. Well, I certainly invite you to ctschicago.edu, where you get a full picture of the institutions, our commitments, etc. But if you really want to get a pulse of what's going on in our life, our Facebook page is the place to go.
Stephen, what's your Facebook page's name?
Our Facebook page is CTS Connect. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Dr. Sims.
So President Angela Sims, President of Colgate Rochester Crozer Divinity School, President Stephen Ray, Chicago Theological Seminary, I thank you so much for this rich and engaging conversation that these spaces are places where we can think aloud in front of people so people can access information that we take for granted, but that we need to have in a broader conversation. And that's what these Wabash webinars are for. If viewers and listeners are interested in sending out these recordings, know that the webinar itself with video is uploaded on our website, as well as Paul Myrie then also puts it in podcast or simply audio form that will also be available on our website. Thank you to Paul Myrie and to Carly Hollinsby for being the support staff for this program. And again, thank you, my guests, Stephen and Angela.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you.
And we're out. What a terrific conversation.